To her ruthless parents, a barren daughter was defective property, sold to the city's most feared syndicate boss to clear a staggering debt. 22-year-old Clara expected brutality, perhaps even death. Instead, she walked into a heavily guarded estate, found 4 grieving children and a monster who desperately needed a queen. The sterile, blindingly white walls of Dr. Aris Mitchell's office at Mount Sinai Hospital felt like a tomb. Clara Harrington sat frozen in the leather chair, the words echoing in her mind with a deafening finality. Premature ovarian failure. Combined with a severe untreated uterine anomaly, the diagnosis was absolute. She would never conceive. She would never carry a child. At 22 years old, her body had closed a door that most women hadn't even begun to think about opening. But for Clara, this was not just a personal tragedy. It was a death sentence for her family's legacy. The Harringtons of Greenwich, Connecticut, were old money, or at least they desperately pretended to be. Behind the manicured lawns, the sprawling estate, and the exclusive country club memberships, her parents, Arthur and Beatrice, were drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Clara had always known she was merely a pawn on their chessboard, an asset to be polished, paraded, and eventually traded to a wealthy heir to secure the family's financial salvation. When she returned home and delivered the news, hoping for a shred of maternal comfort, she was met with a chilling silence. Beatrice's manicured hand stopped midair, a teacup rattling against the saucer. Arthur, a man whose gambling addiction had recently escalated from private Manhattan poker gains to owing millions to dangerous lenders, turned ashen. "Barren," Arthur whispered, the word dripping with disgust rather than pity. He paced the length of the Persian rug in his study, raking a hand through his thinning silver hair. "Do you realize what this means? The Astor family will withdraw their proposal by tomorrow morning once the medical records leak. They need an heir, Clara. You are entirely useless to them now." "Sorry, Father," Clara choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "So the doctor said it's genetic. There's nothing I can do. Sorry doesn't pay the $4.2 million I owe to the Falcone family." "Ha ha ha ha!" Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "You think the syndicate cares about your apologies? Lorenzo Falcone is going to take my life, strip this estate down to the copper wiring, and leave your mother and me in the gutters." Uncanny. Beatrice stood up, her eyes hard and calculating. She looked at her daughter, not as a grieving mother, but as an auditor assessing a depreciated asset. "There is another way. We can't offer her to high society, but perhaps the underworld has a different use for her." 3 days later, the air in the Harrington estate was thick with impending doom. Black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up the gravel driveway, their heavy tires crunching like breaking bones. Men in tailored suits with unnatural bulges beneath their jackets stepped out and secured the perimeter. Finally, Lorenzo Falcone emerged. Lorenzo was a phantom in the criminal underworld, a man whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror. At 36, he was the undisputed head of the Eastern Syndicate. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man, his sharp jawline shadowed by a dark beard, and his piercing, storm-gray eyes missed nothing. A faint, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a brutal reminder that he was a survivor of a ruthless life. Clara stood trembling in the corner of the grand drawing room as Lorenzo took a seat opposite her sweating father. Lorenzo didn't touch the scotch Arthur had nervously poured for him. "You owe me $4,250,000, Arthur," as Lorenzo's voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the crystal chandeliers. "And my associates tell me you've been liquidating your assets just to pay off the interest. You have nothing left." I have her, Arthur said, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara. Lorenzo's gaze shifted to Clara. His eyes were cold, assessing, stripping away her dignity in a single glance. Clara held her breath, waiting for the monster to strike her down. A bride? Lorenzo scoffed softly, leaning back. I am not a human trafficker, Arthur. And I certainly do not need a pampered Greenwich debutante. She's obedient. Educated. Gate, Beatrice interjected, desperation making her voice shrill. And she can never have children. She is barren. The room went deathly quiet. Lorenzo's enforcers, standing by the doors, shifted uncomfortably. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, humiliated beyond measure. To be sold was horrifying. To be sold with a disclaimer of her physical defects was soul-crushing. But Lorenzo didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locking onto Clara with a sudden, intense focus. Lorenzo repeated, rolling the word around as if tasting it. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Lorenzo stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked over to Clara, who shrank back against the wall. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently tilting her chin up, so she was forced to look into his stormy eyes. He searched her face, looking for something hidden in her terrified expression. Pack your things, Lorenzo commanded softly. He turned back to Arthur, his expression hardening into granite. Sosh, the debt is cleared. But hear me well, Arthur. If you or your wife ever reach out to her, if you ever attempt to contact her or exploit her again, I will have you buried under the foundation of my next casino. Do we have an understanding? Arthur nodded frantically, relief washing over his pathetic features. Yes, Mr. Falcone. Yes, completely. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her parents hadn't even said goodbye. They had just erased her from their lives to save their own skins. As she was escorted out of the house she had grown up in, clutching a single leather duffel bag, Clara knew she was walking straight into hell. The drive to Long Island's North Shore was suffocatingly quiet. Clara sat in the back of the armored Cadillac, staring blindly at the passing trees, terrified to even breathe too loudly. Lorenzo sat beside her, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. He was answering encrypted emails on a tablet, seemingly indifferent to the terrified young woman trembling in his vehicle. When they finally passed through the imposing wrought-iron gates of the Falcone compound, Clara gasped softly. It wasn't just an estate, it was a fortress. High stone walls, security cameras tracking their every move, and armed guards patrolling the sprawling manicured grounds. The mansion itself was a massive Gothic-inspired marvel of dark stone and towering windows, overlooking the turbulent waters of the Atlantic Sound. Clara was escorted into Lorenzo's private study, a massive room lined with thousands of books, smelling of old paper, rich leather, and faint cigar smoke. He motioned for her to sit in a velvet armchair, while he walked around to sit behind a heavy oak desk. Let me be clear about why you are here, Clara, Lorenzo began, abandoning any pretense of polite small talk. 2 years ago, my wife Isabella was murdered. A car bomb meant for me. Since then, my home has been chaotic. I have 4 children. Clara blinked, stunned. Yes, Leo is 12. Sophia is 9. The twins, Matteo and Luca, are 5. They have had countless nannies, tutors, and caretakers. None of them last. The children terrify them, or the nannies try to seduce me to secure a permanent place in my empire. Lorenzo's lip curled in disgust. My children need a mother, not an employee. They need a constant presence. Someone who belongs to this house. But I can't, Clara stammered, her cheeks burning. My parents told you. I can't give you an heir, Lorenzo interrupted, leaning forward. Sir, that is precisely why I accepted your father's disgusting proposal. In my world, bloodlines are everything. If I were to marry a fertile woman, she would eventually bear my child. And then, human nature being what it is, she would view my firstborn sons as obstacles. She would scheme. She would plot to put her own biological children at the head of the syndicate. It has happened 100 times in our history, and it always ends in a bloodbath. Clara stared at him, the brutal, calculating logic of his words washing over her. Cannot have children, Lorenzo continued, his voice softening just a fraction. Which means you will never have a biological imperative to betray my sons. You can love them, raise them, and protect them without any divided loyalty. If you do this, if you care for my children and bring peace to my home, you will want for nothing. You will have my protection, my wealth, and my respect. But if you betray me, or if you harm them, Hattie didn't need to finish the sentence. The coldness in his eyes said enough. Before Clara could process the immense weight of the contract she had just been forced into, the heavy oak doors to the study burst open. A boy stood in the doorway. He was tall for his age, with Lorenzo's dark hair and a furious, hostile expression. Behind him peeked a young girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, her large brown eyes wide with anxiety. Further back, 2 identical little boys in matching pajamas were wrestling with a golden retriever. Sit true? The oldest boy, Leo, demanded, marching into the room and ignoring his father's warning glare. He pointed an accusatory finger at Clara. Is she the new one? How long until this one runs away crying, Papa? Show respect. Lorenzo's voice cracked like a whip. This is Clara. She is not a nanny. She is going to be your stepmother. The word hung in the air, explosive and heavy. Sophia, the 9-year-old, shrank back, burying her face in her stuffed rabbit. The twins stopped wrestling and stared. Leo's face flushed with a mixture of grief and sheer rage. I don't want a stepmother. My mother is dead. Enough. Lorenzo stood, the sheer force of his presence silencing the room. But Clara could see the exhaustion behind his anger. He was a king who could command armies, but he had no idea how to comfort a broken child. Clara slowly stood up. Her heart was pounding violently against her ribs, but something shifted inside her. For years, she had felt useless, broken, a defective disappointment to her parents. But looking at these 4 children feral, grieving, and desperately needing a tether, she realized they were just as broken as she was. Ignoring Lorenzo's tense posture, Clara slowly sank to her knees, so she was eye level with the twins and Sophia, who was still hiding behind Leo. It's right, Clara said softly, her voice steady. The room went silent. Even Lorenzo watched her with narrowed eyes. Your mother is gone, and no one can ever replace her. I'm not here to erase her memory, Leo. I don't want to take her place. Leo blinked, thrown off guard by her directness. Why are you here? Clara offered a sad, genuine smile. Because my family didn't want me anymore. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Your father offered me a safe place to stay, and in return, he asked me to help you. We're just strangers sharing a very big, very quiet house. Maybe we can just start there. Sophia peeked out from behind her brother, her brown eyes studying Clara's face. Slowly, the little girl stepped forward and held out her stuffed rabbit. His name is Barnaby. He lost his ear. Clara reached out, gently touching the frayed fabric of the toy. He looks like a very brave rabbit, Sophia. Lorenzo stood motionless behind his desk, watching the exchange. For the first time in 2 years, the suffocating tension in the house seemed to crack, letting in a microscopic sliver of light. But the underworld never sleeps. As Clara helped the children up to their rooms that evening, tucking the twins into bed, a massive explosion rocked the western wing of the compound, shattering the windows and throwing Clara violently to the floor. The war Lorenzo had tried to shield his family from had just arrived at their front door. The deafening roar of the explosion swallowed the night, tearing through the reinforced glass of the western wing like it was made of fragile sugar. The shockwave lifted Clara off her feet, throwing her violently against the heavy mahogany dresser in the twins' bedroom. The Grand Falcone estate, a fortress that had stood impenetrable on Long Island's North Shore for decades, was suddenly plunged into chaotic darkness, illuminated only by the vicious, hungry orange flames licking the exterior walls. Ears ringing, lungs burning from the sudden influx of acrid plaster dust and cordite, Clara scrambled across the debris-littered floor. Panic, raw and suffocating, threatened to freeze her blood. But then she heard it, the terrified, piercing screams of 5-year-old Matteo and Luca. Her own pain vanished. The diagnosis from Mount Sinai, the stinging humiliation of her father's betrayal, the sheer terror of Lorenzo's world, none of it mattered. In a fraction of a second, an innate, primal instinct clawed its way out of Clara's chest. She might have been clinically barren, but the fierce, undeniable drive to protect these children surged through her veins like liquid adrenaline. Matteo! Luca! Clara coughed, dragging herself through the shattered drywall. She found the twins huddled in the corner of their sprawling bedroom, trembling uncontrollably under a pile of heavy down comforters. She threw her arms around them, shielding their small bodies with her own as a secondary, smaller explosion rocked the grounds outside. Horror! The frantic shout came from the hallway. Leo, the 12-year-old who had glared at her with such venom just hours ago, stumbled into the room. His face was streaked with soot, a nasty gash bleeding freely down his left forearm. He had Sophia by the hand, the little girl clutching her one-eared rabbit Barnaby so tightly her knuckles were white. "Get down," Clara commanded, her voice stripping away its usual Greenwich prep school softness, replaced by a hardened edge that shocked even her. She reached out, yanking Leo and Sophia down into the small, sheltered alcove between the heavy oak wardrobe and the reinforced load-bearing wall. Downstairs, the staccato popping of automatic gunfire erupted. Lorenzo's security detail, highly trained ex-military contractors, armed with custom Sig Sauers and M4 carbines, were engaging the intruders. "This is the Morettas," Leo whispered, his voice cracking as he tried desperately to maintain the brave facade of the syndicate's air. He pressed his hand against his bleeding arm, wincing. "Papa said Carmine Moretti was pushing our borders in Queens." "It doesn't matter who it is," Clara said fiercely. She ripped the hem of her expensive silk blouse without a second thought, wrapping the fabric tightly around Leo's bleeding arm to create a makeshift tourniquet. "We need to move. Where is the safe room, Leo?" "Your father must have built one. Sub-basement level 2. Behind the wine cellar," Leo replied, his eyes wide as he looked at this fragile society girl who was currently acting like a seasoned combat medic. "Show me the way. Keep your heads down." Paul hoisted Luca onto her hip and grabbed Matteo's hand, gesturing for Leo to lead the way with Sophia. The descent through the mansion was a nightmare. The grand, sweeping staircase where Clara had walked just hours before was littered with shattered crystal from the chandelier and splintered wood. Smoke thickened the air, setting off the shrill wail of the estate's automated fire suppression alarms. As they reached the ground floor, a shadow moved at the end of the corridor. A man in tactical gear, not wearing the Falcone crest, raised a weapon. Before Clara could even scream, a deafening shot rang out from the adjacent study. The intruder dropped instantly. Lorenzo stepped out of the shadows. His tailored suit jacket was gone, his white dress shirt stained with soot and blood. In his hands he held a sleek, smoking Glock 19. His storm-grey eyes were wild, scanning the wreckage until they locked onto Clara and the children. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia boss let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees. He didn't check the perimeter. He didn't check his weapon. He pulled Leo, Sofia, Matteo, Luca, and Clara into a desperate, crushing embrace. "You have them," Lorenzo murmured into Clara's hair, his deep voice trembling with an emotion that the underworld had never seen. You kept them safe. "Get us to the bunker, Lorenzo," Clara said, her voice shaking but her eyes locked fiercely with his. Now." He nodded, snapping back into the hardened general. He led them down through the sprawling, climate-controlled wine cellar, bypassing racks of vintage Bordeaux to press his palm against a hidden biometric scanner. A heavy, titanium-reinforced door slid open, revealing a state-of-the-art panic room equipped with monitors, medical supplies, and an independent ventilation system. Once the heavy door sealed shut behind them, the terrifying sounds of the war above were completely muted. The silence in the bright, sterile room was deafening. Clara immediately went to the medical supply cabinet, pulling out gauze, antiseptic, and bandages. She knelt beside Leo, replacing her torn silk blouse with proper dressing. She worked methodically, murmuring soft, comforting praises to the boy. She then moved to Sofia, wiping the soot from the girl's tear-stained cheeks and checking the twins for injuries. Lorenzo stood by the bank of security monitors, watching his men neutralize the remaining threats on the property. But his gaze kept drifting back to Clara. He watched this 22-year-old woman, sold to him as defective property, acting with more courage and maternal devotion than anyone he had ever known. Leo looked up at his father, then down at Clara, who was gently washing a scratch on Matteo's knee. The hostility that had clouded the boy's eyes earlier was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, silent respect. "You didn't run," Leo said softly, speaking to Clara but looking at his father. "You could have run out the back when the glass broke. But you came for us." Clara paused, brushing a lock of hair out of Matteo's eyes. She looked up, her gaze meeting Lorenzo's across the room. "I told you," she said, her voice steady and resolute. I'm not going anywhere." In the cold, clinical light of the underground bunker, Lorenzo realized that Arthur Harrington was a fool. The man hadn't sold him a broken asset. He had handed Lorenzo the exact missing piece of his shattered empire. He had given him a queen. It took 3 days for the smoke to clear and the blood to be washed from the gravel of the Falcone estate. The attack, orchestrated by the rival Moretti family, had been a desperate, coordinated strike aimed at decapitating the Eastern Syndicate. They had failed, but Lorenzo's retaliation was swift, brutal, and absolute. By Wednesday morning, Carmine Moretti was a ghost, and the Falcone borders were secured, yet a dark cloud hung over Lorenzo's study. The security breach had been too precise. The Morettis had known exactly when the shift changes occurred at the perimeter, and they had known the frequency of the automated gate transponders. Someone had given them the keys to the castle. Clara sat by the fireplace in Lorenzo's study, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. The twins were asleep upstairs, and Sofia was reading to Leo in the adjacent library. The Canuck events of the siege had permanently bonded Clara to the children. She was no longer the new one. She was simply Clara, the woman who had shielded them from the fire. The heavy oak doors opened and Lorenzo walked in. His face was a mask of cold fury, a stark contrast to the gentleman who had held her in the bunker. Behind him, two of his most trusted enforcers dragged a trembling, bruised figure into the room, forcing him into a chair opposite Clara. Clara's teacup rattled against her saucer. Her breath hitched. It was Arthur Harrington. Her father looked pathetic. His expensive Brioni suit was torn, his silver hair was disheveled, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. When he looked up and saw Clara, a sickening mix of relief and desperate calculation washed over his face. "Clara! Oh, thank God, Est!" Arthur gasped, straining against the zip ties binding his wrists. "Tell him, Clara. Tell him it's a misunderstanding." Lorenzo walked behind his desk, pouring a glass of scotch but not drinking it. He looked at Arthur with eyes as dead as winter ice. Carmine Moretti's second-in-command was very talkative before he expired, Lorenzo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Two told me they purchased our security codes from a desperate, gambling-addicted socialite, a man who thought he could sell his daughter to clear one debt and then sell his son-in-law to a rival cartel to secure a retirement fund." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Father?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Gave them the codes. You knew I was in this house. You knew his children were here." Arthur stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Ugh, I made them promise not to hurt you." Carmine said they only wanted Lorenzo. "They were going to extract you, Clara. Bring you back home. We could have found you a proper husband in the Hamptons with the money Moretti paid me. You greedy, spineless coward," Lorenzo interrupted, the sheer venom in his voice making Arthur flinch violently. "You sent a kill squad into a home with 4 sleeping children. You jeopardized the life of your own daughter for a payout." The hack, Lorenzo drew his Glock from his shoulder holster, placing it on the heavy oak desk with a heavy, resonant thud. He looked at Clara. "In my world, treason is paid with blood," Lorenzo said softly, speaking only to her. "But he is your blood. He is the man who raised you, who sold you, and who just tried to bury you. I told you that you are under my protection, Clara. That includes protection from your own past." Soc Lorenzo gestured to the weapon. "I am the head of this syndicate, but you are the mother of my home. You protected my children when I could not, so you decide. Give the word, Clara, and he never leaves this room." Arthur began to openly weep, struggling against his restraints. "Clara, please, I'm your father. You can't let this monster kill me. You're a Harrington. You're not one of them." Clara stood up slowly. She looked at the man who had treated her like a defective balance sheet her entire life. She remembered the cold sterility of Dr. Mitchell's office, the way Arthur had looked at her with pure disgust when he learned she was barren. And then she thought of Leo's brave face in the smoke, Sophia's little hand clutching hers, and the fierce protective embrace of the man standing behind the desk. She walked over to her father. She didn't touch the gun. She didn't need to. "I was never a Harrington to you, Arthur," Clara said, her voice frighteningly calm, echoing the authority of the man she was learning to love. "I was property. You sold me because I was barren, thinking I was worthless. But you made a terrible mistake. You sent me to a man who didn't need my biology. He needed my loyalty. And you sent me to children who didn't need my blood. They needed my heart." She leaned in closer, her eyes entirely devoid of pity. "A single farthing. If you or Mother ever come near Long Island, if you ever breathe the name Falcone again, Lorenzo won't have to pull that trigger. I will do it myself." She stood up, turning her back on him completely. She looked at Lorenzo. "Get this trash out of my house, and strip him of whatever money Moretti paid him. leave him with nothing. A slow, dark smile spread across Lorenzo's face, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. He nodded to his enforcers. You heard my wife. Dump him in the city. If he contacts us again, break his legs. As Arthur was dragged screaming from the study, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him, the suffocating tension in the room evaporated. Lorenzo holstered his weapon and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Clara. He reached out, his calloused hands gently framing her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening into the gentle rumble that was reserved only for her and the children. Clara leaned into his touch, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat against her palms as she rested her hands on his chest. "And now, I'm exactly where I am supposed to be." Lorenzo leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was a promise, a vow, and a surrender, all at once. It was a kiss that sealed their contract, not in ink, but in soul. 6 months later, the Harrington name was nothing but a cautionary tale of bankruptcy and ruin in Greenwich high society. But in the heavily fortified walls of the Falcone estate, life had blossomed. Clara sat at the head of a massive dining table, laughing as the twins tried to sneak meatballs to their golden retriever. Sophia was proudly showing off a drawing of their family 6 stick figures standing together, while Leo debated strategy with his father. Clara looked at the man at the head of the table. Lorenzo caught her eye, raising his glass of vintage red wine in a silent, loving toast to the woman who had saved them all. She couldn't create life, but she had resurrected a family. And in the ruthless world of the Mafia, the Barren daughter had become the most powerful queen of all. Did you expect that twist with Clara's father? Sometimes the most broken pieces make the strongest armor. If Clara and Lorenzo's fierce, unconventional Mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a good enemies to lovers crime drama. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling original audio stories every single week.